For over a century, scientists have been piecing together one of humanity's greatest migration stories: how and when the first people reached the Americas. The questions have always been tantalizing. When did they arrive? Where did they come from? What route did they take? How many migrations were there? Traditional archaeology provided some clues: stone tools, ancient campsites, and scattered human remains. But these physical traces could only tell us so much. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: tiny fragments of genetic material preserved in ancient bones and teeth, and even more surprisingly, in the DNA of people living today. Recent genetic studies have revolutionized our understanding, revealing a complex, fascinating story of human movement, adaptation, and survival that is far more intricate than anyone imagined. The story begins not in the Americas, but in Siberia, approximately 40,000 years ago. Genetic evidence shows that the ancestors of Native Americans were part of a broader East Asian population living in northeastern Siberia. These were hardy people adapted to some of the harshest conditions on Earth, surviving brutal winters, hunting mammoth and other megafauna, and developing sophisticated technologies for life in extreme cold. Around 36,000 years ago, something happened that would change the course of human history. A subset of this Siberian population became genetically isolated from their Asian relatives. This isolation wasn't immediate or complete, but over thousands of years, this group developed unique genetic characteristics that would later define all Native American peoples. The key to understanding what happened next lies in a place that no longer exists. Beringia was a vast landmass, sometimes called a subcontinent, that connected Siberia to Alaska during periods when sea levels were lower. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, so much water was locked up in ice sheets that sea levels dropped by as much as 400 feet, exposing a land bridge over 1,000 miles wide. Beringia wasn't a narrow strip of land that people dashed across. It was a massive territory with its own ecosystems, grasslands teeming with animals, river valleys, and areas where humans could live and thrive. And genetic evidence suggests they did exactly that for thousands of years. Here's where the genetic clues become crucial. When researchers compare DNA from ancient remains and modern Native Americans with DNA from Asian populations, they find something unexpected. There's a gap, a period of genetic isolation where Native American ancestors weren't mixing with Asian populations, but also hadn't yet spread throughout the Americas. This period, called the Beringian standstill, likely lasted from approximately 25,000 to 15,000 years ago. During this time, ancestral Native Americans were stuck in Beringia and adjacent ice-free areas of Alaska and northeastern Siberia. Massive ice sheets covering Canada blocked their path south. They couldn't advance further into the Americas, so they remained in these northern refuges, adapting, evolving, and developing the unique genetic signatures that researchers can now detect. The genetic evidence for this standstill is compelling. Scientists analyzed thousands of genetic markers from both ancient and modern indigenous peoples across the Americas. They found that Native American populations show reduced genetic diversity compared to Asian populations. Exactly what you'd expect from a founding population that went through a bottleneck, a period where population size was small and genetic variation was reduced. More importantly, the timing of genetic splits between Native American lineages and their closest Asian relatives matches this 25,000 to 15,000 year ago window, confirming that populations were isolated during this period. But then something changed. Around 15,000 to 14,000 years ago, the ice sheets began to melt. Two massive glaciers, the Laurentide covering eastern Canada and the Cordilleran covering western Canada, started to retreat. As they melted, they opened pathways south. The traditional theory held that an ice-free corridor opened between these glaciers, creating a route from Alaska into the interior of North America. However, recent genetic and archaeological evidence suggests an alternative that changes everything. The first people to move south likely didn't walk through an ice corridor at all. They traveled by boat along the Pacific coast. Genetic clues support this coastal migration hypothesis in several ways. First, the speed of population expansion. Genetic data shows that humans reached the southern tip of South America by at least 14,500 years ago, possibly earlier. That's over 10,000 miles from Alaska in just a few centuries. Walking through unknown territory with ice, mountains, and harsh conditions would make this rapid spread nearly impossible. But if people were following the coast in boats, hopping from beach to beach, inlet to inlet, following rich marine resources like kelp forests, fish, seals, and seabirds, they could cover vast distances much faster. Modern experiments have shown that simple boats or rafts could have made this journey entirely feasible. Second, genetic connections between coastal populations separated by vast distances suggest maritime contact. Ancient DNA from sites along the Pacific coast of North America shows genetic similarities to populations from coastal South America that are stronger than connections to interior populations at similar latitudes. This pattern makes sense if people were traveling primarily along coastlines, maintaining contact with other coastal groups while remaining more isolated from interior populations. Third, the timing of genetic divergence between populations matches a coastal route better than an interior route. Genetic analysis shows that populations in South America diverged from North American populations very early, possibly within 1,000 years of the initial entry into the Americas. This rapid split is more consistent with fast coastal migration than slow overland movement through difficult terrain. The genetic evidence also reveals that the peopling of the Americas wasn't a single migration event. At least 3 major genetic components contributed to Native American ancestry. The first and largest component is what researchers call the first American ancestry, shared by nearly all indigenous peoples from Canada to Chile. This represents the initial migration, the people who traveled down the Pacific coast and spread throughout both continents. But there were later migrations as well. A second migration, occurring perhaps 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, brought people who would become the Na-Dene speakers, including Navajo, Apache, and various Athabascan groups in Canada and Alaska. Genetic analysis shows these populations carry ancestry that's distinct from the first American component, suggesting their ancestors came from a later migration from Siberia. Finally, a third migration brought the ancestors of Inuit and Aleut peoples around 5,000 years ago. These populations show the strongest genetic connections to modern Siberians, indicating they were the most recent arrivals. Perhaps most remarkably, genetic analysis has revealed evidence of back migration, people moving from the Americas back into Asia. A 2019 study found genetic markers in some Siberian populations that could only have come from Native American ancestors, suggesting that at some point, probably within the last few thousand years, people from the Americas crossed back over the Bering Strait into Asia. This shows that the Bering region wasn't a one-way door, but rather a corridor for movement in both directions across millennia. The genetic evidence has also revealed surprising details about ancient population sizes and structure. By analyzing genetic diversity and using sophisticated modeling techniques, researchers estimate that the founding population that entered the Americas was relatively small, probably just a few hundred to a few thousand individuals. This small founding population explains why Native Americans, despite spreading across 2 massive continents with incredibly diverse environments, show less overall genetic variation than populations in Africa or Asia, where human populations have been large and diverse for much longer. But small founding population doesn't mean low numbers for long. Genetic evidence shows rapid population growth after the initial arrival. Within a few thousand years, millions of people inhabited the Americas. This population expansion left genetic signatures that researchers can still detect. Populations grew fastest in areas with abundant resources, coastal regions, river valleys, and places where agriculture would later develop. In these areas, genetic diversity increased as populations expanded and local adaptations evolved. The genetics have also revealed sophisticated details about how ancient Americans adapted to their environments. Analysis of ancient genomes shows genetic changes related to diet, particularly genes involved in metabolizing different types of foods. Coastal populations show genetic adaptations related to high seafood diets. High-altitude populations in the Andes evolved genetic changes that helped them cope with low oxygen levels, including variants in genes affecting hemoglobin and blood. Oxygen transport. Arctic populations developed genetic adaptations for cold climate and high-fat diets. These adaptations occurred relatively quickly, within just a few thousand years, demonstrating how powerfully natural selection can shape human genetics. One of the most exciting frontiers in this research involves analyzing ancient DNA from the Bering region itself. As climate change causes permafrost to melt in Alaska and Siberia, more ancient remains are being discovered. Each new genome from these critical regions fills in gaps in our understanding of what happened during that long standstill period. Recently discovered remains from Alaska dated to 11,500 years ago revealed a previously unknown population, the ancient Beringians, who were genetically distinct from other Native Americans and apparently remained isolated in Alaska for thousands of years before eventually disappearing or being absorbed into later populations. The genetic reconstruction of the first Americans demonstrates how powerful DNA evidence has become for understanding human history. What were once educated guesses based on limited archaeological data are now detailed, testable hypotheses supported by thousands of genetic markers from hundreds of ancient and modern individuals. We can now say with confidence not just when people arrived, but where they came from, how long they waited in Beringia, what route they took south, how quickly they spread, and even what they ate and how they adapted to new environments. Yet for all we've learned, mysteries remain. Why did the ancestors of Native Americans become isolated from Asian populations 36,000 years ago? What triggered the initial movement into Beringia? What were conditions like during the Beringian standstill? Were there even earlier migrations that left no genetic trace? As technology improves and more ancient DNA is recovered, particularly from coastal sites now underwater, we'll continue to refine this story, adding detail and nuance to humanity's incredible journey into the New World. Thanks for watching. If you found this genetic detective story fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Let us know in the comments what other ancient migration mysteries you'd like us to explore. Until next time, keep following the genetic clues into our past.